What if I told you that deep inside you right now, there is something as radiant, as limitless, as profound as the Buddha himself? Not a belief, not a fantasy, but a truth that has been whispered across centuries of Buddhist teaching. Everyone has Buddha nature. The problem is not that we lack it. The problem is that we've forgotten it. Imagine a poor traveler, wandering from village to village, living in hunger and hardship. He doesn't know that long ago, someone secretly stitched a priceless jewel into the lining of his coat. He begs for scraps, feels unworthy, and struggles for survival, all while carrying unimaginable wealth against his very skin. That traveler is us. The jewel is our Buddha nature, and our suffering is not because we don't have it, but because we don't realize it's already there. This is why the teaching matters. We live in an age where people feel more lost than ever. Anxiety, self-doubt, loneliness, they haunt us like shadows. We search desperately for meaning outside ourselves, in achievements, in money, in approval from others. And yet, even when we get what we thought we wanted, it often feels strangely empty. Why? Because the treasure we're looking for isn't out there. It's been inside all along. But let's be honest, if it's really there, why don't we feel it? Why don't we wake up every morning glowing with Buddha-like peace? The answer is simple, yet profound. Clouds can hide the sun, but they can never destroy it. Mud can cover a diamond, but it can't take away its brilliance. In the same way, greed, anger, fear, and ignorance veil our Buddha nature. We don't need to manufacture enlightenment, we only need to clear away what blocks it. Think about it. Even when you've been at your worst, angry, selfish, full of regret, something in you still longs to be better. That longing, that faint pull toward goodness and truth, is the whisper of Buddha nature. It never abandons you. It cannot be destroyed. It is the most indestructible part of who you are. And here's the beauty. Awakening is not about becoming something else, someone holy or someone special. It's about remembering what you already are. The Buddha himself, when he sat under the Bodhi tree, didn't receive enlightenment from some outside power. He simply saw into his own nature and recognized it fully. When he rose, he said, "Wonder of wonders, all beings are already enlightened. They only don't realize it." This truth is not locked in ancient texts or monasteries. It is alive right here, right now. The smile of a mother holding her child, the compassion of a stranger helping another, the quiet courage in the face of suffering, all of these are glimpses of Buddha nature shining through ordinary life. We don't have to invent it, we only have to see it. But here's where the struggle lies. Modern life is noisy. Our minds are restless. We are constantly pulled outward by glowing screens, endless comparisons, and a culture that tells us we're never enough. The jewel inside us feels distant, almost impossible to touch. Yet this very restlessness, this constant chasing, can become the spark that pushes us to ask, is there something more? That question, born from dissatisfaction, is often the first knock on the door of awakening. So why does this teaching matter? Because it reminds us that no matter how lost we feel, we are never truly broken. Even in our darkest moments, the seed of awakening is alive within us. And once we begin to realize this, life transforms. Challenges stop being punishments and start becoming teachers. Pain becomes the fire that purifies. Every breath becomes a chance to touch the truth of who we are. This is not just philosophy. It's a living reality that people across centuries have experienced. Monks in silent temples, farmers working the land, seekers in crowded cities, all discovering the same thing. The jewel is real. The treasure is within. And the question is not whether you have it. You do. The question is, will you awaken to it? If the jewel is hidden in our coat, if the treasure has been with us all along, then the question rises, what exactly is this thing we call Buddha nature? It's tempting to imagine it as some mystical energy, a secret force glowing inside us. But Buddha nature is not a magical object, not a spirit floating within. It is something far more intimate, far more ordinary, and that is what makes it extraordinary. Buddha nature is the deepest potential of the human heart and mind. It is the natural clarity of awareness before it is clouded by greed, anger, and fear. It is the spontaneous compassion that arises when we see another being suffer and cannot help but want to ease their pain. It is wisdom that knows, even if just for a moment, that everything is interconnected. In the Mahayana Sutras, the Buddha used many metaphors to point to this. He spoke of a diamond hidden in rock. He spoke of a lotus rising unstained from muddy water. He spoke of pure gold covered in dirt, waiting to be uncovered. Each image reminds us the purity is already there. It doesn't need to be created, it needs to be revealed. But here's the subtlety. Buddha nature is not the ego. It's not the me that wants to feel special, enlightened, or superior. In fact, as long as we cling to the idea, I want to awaken my Buddha nature so that I can be somebody, still trapped in illusion. The true nature is beyond the small self. It's not about polishing the ego, it's about seeing through it. Consider this. When the sky clears after a storm, the vast blue space was never gone. The clouds came and went, thunder roared and vanished, but the sky was always there untouched. Buddha nature is like that sky. Thoughts, emotions, dramas, they pass through. But the openness of mind, the possibility of awakening, never disappears. This is why, in the Tathagata Teachings, it is said that all beings, humans, animals, even the cruel and the ignorant, carry this seed of Buddhahood. No one is excluded. The cruelest tyrant, the kindest saint, the most confused wanderer, all carry the same potential. The only difference is how much it is hidden. And that raises a profound point. If Buddha nature is truly universal, then it changes how we see ourselves and how we see others. It means no one is beyond redemption. No one is a permanent enemy. Even the person who wrongs you has the same hidden jewel, the same untouched purity, buried beneath their anger and ignorance. To see this is to soften the heart. To see this is to begin to awaken compassion. But let's bring this closer to our lives. Think of the moments when you felt an unexpected surge of kindness, helping a stranger, comforting a friend, feeling a sudden awe before nature. In those moments, the ordinary chatter of the mind fell silent and something deeper shone through. That flash of goodness, that clarity, that sense of connection, that is Buddha nature making itself known. It doesn't always feel grand. Sometimes it's as small as choosing not to say a harsh word, or pausing to breathe before reacting in anger. Sometimes it's as subtle as noticing a bird in flight and feeling, even for a second, that you and that bird are not so different. These small awakenings are like cracks in the shell of ignorance, letting the light of Buddha nature leak through. And here is the beautiful paradox. Buddha nature is both utterly ordinary and utterly sacred. It doesn't require us to escape to mountaintops or monasteries. It is found in the messy, complicated, everyday world, in washing dishes, in working a difficult job, in loving and losing, in falling and standing back up again. The ordinary mind, when seen clearly, is the gateway to the extraordinary. But to recognize Buddha nature is not yet to live from it. Recognition is the first glimpse, like seeing the sun break through clouds. Living from it is learning how to trust that light, how to nurture it, how to let it shine even when storms return. And storms always return. That is why the path of practice is needed. Meditation, mindfulness, ethical living, these are not tools to create Buddha nature, but tools to uncover it. They help us peel back the layers of greed, fear, and delusion until what has always been there can shine. So, what is Buddha nature? It is your deepest truth, your original clarity, your capacity for infinite compassion and wisdom. It is not something to acquire, but something to remember. It is not distant, but closer than your own breath. And yet, knowing this is only the beginning, because the question still lingers. If it's already here, if it's already who we are, then why do we struggle so much to see it? Why does life often feel like we're chasing after something forever out of reach? The answer lies in the veil that covers the jewel, the obstacles, the illusions, the restless ignorance that blinds us to what we already carry. And it is there in that darkness that our journey now turns. If Buddha nature is already here, shining quietly within us, then why do we struggle to feel it? Why does it seem like something distant, hidden, almost unreachable? The answer is not that Buddha nature is weak. The answer is that we are covered by layers of misunderstanding, habit, and illusion. Just as thick clouds can obscure the sun, ignorance obscures our nature. The sun never goes away, but when the sky is heavy with storms, we forget it's even there. In Buddhism, this veil is called avidya, ignorance, not in the sense of stupidity, but in the sense of not seeing clearly. We look, but we do not recognize. We live, but we do not understand what life truly is. Consider this story. A man rides his ox home after working in the fields. As he crosses a river, he suddenly panics. He thinks he's lost his ox. He searches frantically, running along the riverbank, shouting for help, not realizing he's been sitting on the ox the whole time. This is us. We chase after peace, happiness, and enlightenment, all while riding on the very thing we're searching for. Ignorance works in subtle ways. Sometimes it takes the form of greed, the endless hunger for more. We think, if only I had more money, more recognition, more success, then I'd finally be fulfilled. But the more we chase, the more the hunger grows. It's like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. Other times, ignorance wears the mask of anger. We feel wrong, disrespected, unloved. We strike out with words or actions, convinced that if we push others down, we'll rise up. But anger blinds us, turning the world into enemies, when in reality, every enemy is just another being suffering behind their own veil. And sometimes, ignorance is simple distraction. The endless scroll of social media, the constant flood of notifications. We are so busy chasing stimulation that we forget to listen to our own breath. We forget that silence can speak louder than 1,000 voices. This veil is not only personal, it is cultural. From the moment we are young, we're taught to measure ourselves by grades, by beauty, by wealth, by the approval of others. Rarely are we taught that we already carry something priceless within us. And so, we grow up comparing, competing, doubting, feeling never enough. The jewel is there, but the mud is thick. But here is the truth. Ignorance is powerful, but it is not absolute. Clouds may hide the sun, but they can never destroy it. No matter how lost we feel, no matter how many mistakes we make, Buddha nature remains untouched, waiting to be revealed. Sometimes, even in the darkest fog, a small break appears. A moment of silence, a moment of kindness, a moment when the heart softens. These are glimpses through the veil. They remind us that something brighter waits behind the storm. In Zen, there's a saying, "Your nature is like the moon hidden by clouds. Even if it's covered for 1,000 years, it is never lost. One breeze and the moon appears." That breeze can come in many forms. A meditation session where the mind quiets. A loss that makes us question what truly matters. A smile from a stranger that reminds us of our shared humanity. Each is a chance for the veil to thin. But awakening is not about fighting the veil with violence. It's about understanding it. When we see how greed makes us restless, how anger burns us from within, how ignorance keeps us blind, in that very seeing, the veil begins to weaken. Awareness itself is the antidote. And so, the path of Buddhism is not about creating Buddha nature, but about clearing the fog that hides it. Through mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom, we learn to peel back the layers. Slowly, the jewel glimmers through the mud. Slowly, the sky begins to open. Yet stories alone can only inspire. What truly moves us is when we hear of real awakenings, when people, ordinary and extraordinary, touch their Buddha nature and their lives are transformed. Those stories are not myths. They are living proof that the veil can be lifted. And it is to those stories of the Buddha himself and countless seekers across time that we now turn. For thousands of years, people have wrestled with the veil of ignorance. And yet, across time and culture, there are moments when the veil lifts, sometimes gradually, sometimes in a single breath. These stories of awakening remind us that Buddha nature is not just an idea, but a living reality. The most well-known story, of course, is that of the Buddha himself. Siddhartha Gautama was not born enlightened. He was a prince surrounded by luxury, but also haunted by a question: why do we suffer? He saw sickness, old age, and death, and realized that no amount of wealth could shield him from life's inevitable truths. So he left his palace, abandoned comfort, and became a wandering seeker. He tried extreme austerities, starving himself, pushing his body to the edge, but found no freedom there. Finally, he sat beneath the Bodhi tree with a simple vow: I will not rise until I awaken. Through the night, he faced temptation, doubt, fear. But as dawn broke, he looked within and saw clearly. Suffering arises from ignorance, from clinging and craving. And beneath all of it, untouched, is the luminous nature of mind. When he saw this, the veil dissolved. He did not become something new. He recognized what had always been there. In that moment, Siddhartha became the Buddha, the awakened one. But awakening is not reserved for saints or princes. It has appeared in countless lives, often in the most ordinary of places. There is a Zen story of a monk named Huike who desperately sought truth. He came to Bodhidharma, the legendary Indian master who brought Zen to China. Standing in the snow, Huike begged, "Please, master, give me peace of mind." Bodhidharma replied, "Bring me your mind and I will put it to rest." Huike searched inward and finally confessed, "I cannot find it." And Bodhidharma answered, "There, I have already put it to rest." In that instant, Huike awakened. What changed? Nothing. He simply saw that the restless mind he feared was only an illusion. Another tale tells of a farmer in ancient China who spent years listening to Zen monks talk about enlightenment. One day, while tilling his field, he suddenly paused. He heard the sound of a stone striking bamboo, and in that sharp, clear moment, the chatter of his thoughts dropped away. He laughed, realizing the truth wasn't hidden in temples or books. It had been present in every sound, every step, every moment of his life. Even today, stories like this unfold quietly, without headlines. A woman burdened with grief discovers, during meditation, that her pain is real but not her prison. A man drowning in stress at work finds, in one mindful breath, a freedom he never knew existed. These may not be dramatic tales of lightning bolts or cosmic visions, yet they are awakenings, moments when the veil thins and the jewel shines. What these stories teach us is simple. Awakening does not belong to the past, nor to the extraordinary few. It belongs to anyone willing to look deeply, to pause, to see. It can come in silence under a tree, in the chaos of a marketplace, or in the stillness of your own room late at night. It is not about escaping life, but about finally seeing life as it is. And there's something else these stories reveal. Awakening is not the end of the path. It is the beginning of a new way of being. The Buddha continued to teach for 45 years after his awakening. Zen masters kept working, laughing, crying, living ordinary lives. Awakening does not remove us from the world, it roots us more deeply in it, with compassion and clarity. So when we hear these stories, the point is not to admire them from afar, as if they belong to a different kind of human. The point is to let them remind us of what's possible, to feel the stirring inside that whispers, "If they could see, maybe I can too." Because the truth is, you already carry the same seed. The same Buddha nature that awakened under the Bodhi tree lives within you, waiting for the right conditions. And that leads us to a crucial question. If this nature is always here, how do we uncover it? What steps can we take to peel back the veil, to bring the jewel to light, to nurture the seed of awakening in our daily lives? That question brings us to the path of practice. The stories of awakening inspire us, but they also leave us with a lingering question. How do we walk this path ourselves? If the jewel is hidden, how do we uncover it? If the seed is already planted, how do we nurture it to bloom? The Buddha never said awakening was a gift reserved for the chosen few. He offered a path, not a straight highway, but a living journey shaped by practice, discipline, and compassion. The steps are not about adding something new to ourselves, but about removing what blinds us to what is already here. The first step is stillness. In a world that pulls us in 1,000 directions, stillness is revolutionary. Meditation is the heart of this stillness. It is not about forcing the mind to be blank or chasing visions. It is simply about sitting, breathing, and noticing. When we sit quietly and let thoughts rise and fall like waves, we begin to see, I am not my anger. I am not my fears. I am the awareness that sees them. This awareness is a window into Buddha nature. At first, it may feel like just a glimpse, a few seconds of calm before the noise returns. But with practice, those glimpses lengthen. The clouds begin to thin. The jewel begins to shine. The second step is mindfulness in daily life. Awakening is not something found only on a meditation cushion. It is discovered in the small, ordinary acts of living, eating with full presence, walking without rushing, listening to another person without planning your reply. These practices train the mind to return again and again to the present moment, the only place Buddha nature can ever be touched. Imagine washing dishes. Usually we rush through, mind wandering elsewhere. But if we bring full awareness to the warm water, the sound of bubbles, the simple act of cleaning, the moment becomes alive. In that aliveness, we taste a hint of awakening. Suddenly, the sacred is not separate from the ordinary. The third step is ethical living. The Buddha emphasized the precepts not as rules to bind us, but as pathways to freedom. When we refrain from harming, from lying, from exploiting others, our minds naturally grow lighter. Guilt and agitation fade and clarity arises. Ethics polish the jewel, allowing its brilliance to shine without distortion. The fourth step is compassion. Awakening is not only about seeing the truth for ourselves. It is about living from that truth in relation to others. When we understand that every being carries Buddha nature, our hearts naturally open. We begin to see enemies as teachers, strangers as family, even those who hurt us as beings caught in their own veil of ignorance. Compassion is not weakness, it is strength. It is the courage to meet the world not with hatred but with understanding. And in that act, our own Buddha nature awakens more fully. The fifth step is patience and perseverance. Awakening is not a quick fix. Clouds do not vanish in an instant. Sometimes practice feels dry, frustrating, even pointless. But every breath of mindfulness, every act of kindness, every return to stillness, each is a drop of water that slowly wears away the stone of ignorance. One day the jewel shines unexpectedly, and we realize that the effort was never wasted. There is also the question of sudden versus gradual awakening. Some traditions speak of a lightning flash realization, seeing one's nature in a single instant. Others emphasize steady, lifelong cultivation. The truth is, both are possible. The lightning strike often comes after years of gathering fuel. Gradual practice prepares the mind. Sudden insight reveals what has always been. They are not opposed but intertwined. And what about the modern world? Many feel they cannot leave their jobs, families, or obligations to pursue spiritual practice. But the beauty of Buddha nature is that it does not require escape. It can be awakened in the middle of daily life. Your workplace can become your temple. Your relationships can become your teachers. Your struggles can become your practice ground. The path is not about becoming someone else. It is about learning to live more fully as who you already are. Every mindful breath, every act of compassion, every moment of clarity is a step on the path. And as we walk, something changes. We begin to taste freedom, not a freedom from life, but a freedom within life. A freedom that no success or failure can touch. Yet to walk this path, we must also be honest about the obstacles we face. Doubt, fear, distraction, these are part of the journey. The jewel is real, but the mud is thick. To truly understand how to walk forward, we must first face what holds us back. And that takes us into the heart of the next chapter, the obstacles on the journey, and how even they can become teachers. As we walk the path of awakening, there is a force that quietly reshapes us, a force as gentle as water and as strong as mountains. That force is compassion. Compassion is not an ornament to practice. It is its beating heart. To awaken Buddha nature is not just to see clearly, but to feel deeply, to recognize that our lives are woven together with all beings, that no one's suffering is separate from our own. The Buddha once said, just as a mother would protect her only child with her life, so should one cultivate a boundless heart toward all beings. This is not sentimentality, it is the expression of awakening itself. because to see your Buddha nature is also to see it in others. And when you see it in others, you cannot help but care. Think of sunlight. The sun does not choose where to shine. It falls on flowers and weeds alike, on the palace and the prison, on the saint and the sinner. In the same way, true compassion does not discriminate. It does not ask, "Does this person deserve my kindness?" It simply radiates because it sees that every being, beneath their struggles and mistakes, carries the same hidden jewel. History is filled with stories of compassion as the living proof of awakening. When the Buddha met Angulimala, a feared murderer who had taken many lives, he did not curse him or seek revenge. Instead, he looked into Angulimala's heart and saw not only cruelty but the buried seed of Buddha nature. Through compassion, the killer became a monk, his life transformed by a single encounter with unconditional acceptance. Compassion has this power. It does not erase the past, but it creates the conditions for change. It melts the hardest defenses, softens the fiercest anger, and turns even enemies into fellow travelers. And compassion is not limited to dramatic acts. Sometimes it is as simple as listening, really listening, to someone who feels invisible. Sometimes it is offering a smile to a stranger or forgiving yourself after years of self-criticism. In those small gestures, something vast awakens. But here's the paradox. Compassion is not always easy. To feel deeply is to open yourself to the pain of the world, and the world has much pain. At times, it may feel overwhelming. How can one heart carry so much? The answer lies in seeing compassion not as pity, not as drowning in another's suffering, but as connection. When we realize we are not separate, their pain is not a burden we take on. It is a truth we share. From that recognition, action arises naturally. Compassion is not about fixing everything. It is about being present, offering what we can, and trusting that presence itself has power. In fact, compassion protects us. A mind trapped in anger burns itself. A mind guided by compassion finds strength. Neuroscientists today even confirm what Buddhists have long known. Compassion changes the brain, softens stress, and builds resilience. Far from weakening us, compassion makes us more fearless. And perhaps this is the most radical truth. Compassion is awakening. When you act from compassion, even without words of philosophy, you are already touching Buddha nature. The kindness of a hand reaching out, the patience to forgive, the courage to care, these are enlightenment in action. Imagine a world where people live this way. Imagine if, instead of meeting hatred with hatred, we met it with understanding. Imagine if, instead of competing endlessly, we recognize the jewel in each other. Such a world may sound utopian, but it begins with one choice, one heart, one act of compassion at a time. And so, the path is not about retreating from the world to polish our own jewel in isolation. The jewel shines brightest when it illuminates others. Awakening is not complete until it is shared. But sharing the jewel is not always smooth. Along the path, we face obstacles, doubts that whisper, "I'm not good enough," distractions that pull us away, fears that make us turn back. These obstacles are real, and yet they too can become part of the path. Which brings us to the next step in our journey, learning to face the obstacles on the way and discovering how even the mud itself can help the lotus bloom. Every path worth walking has its thorns. The journey toward awakening is no exception. We may hear of Buddha nature, feel inspired by compassion, and even touch moments of clarity, yet soon the old patterns return. The jewel is real, but it remains buried. Why? Because the path is not paved with ease. It is shaped by obstacles, and paradoxically, those obstacles are not enemies. They are the very ground on which awakening grows. The first obstacle is doubt. We wonder, is this real? Do I really have Buddha nature? Am I capable of awakening? Doubt creeps in like a shadow, whispering that the path is too hard, that we are too flawed, too ordinary. Yet doubt is not a wall. It is a question. And when faced directly, questions can open the door to deeper understanding. Even the Buddha himself was not free from doubt before his awakening. What mattered was not the absence of uncertainty, but the courage to keep sitting beneath the Bodhi tree until clarity broke through. The second obstacle is desire and attachment. Our world constantly teaches us that happiness lies just beyond our grasp, in the next purchase, the next achievement, the next relationship. Desire keeps us running endlessly, like a wheel that never stops spinning. And when we cling to what we love, fear of losing it chains us. These cravings cloud our vision, covering the jewel with layer upon layer of dust. Yet within desire itself lies the lesson: nothing we cling to lasts. Seeing this truth, even for a moment, weakens desire's grip. The third obstacle is fear. Awakening means change, and change is terrifying. To see clearly is to let go of illusions we have carried for years, even illusions that once comforted us. Fear tells us, stay where you are. Don't disturb the familiar. But the path asks us to step into the unknown, to trust that letting go is not loss but freedom. Fear is natural, but when we meet it with compassion, it becomes fuel for courage. The fourth obstacle is distraction. Never before in history have we lived with so much noise. Notifications, endless news, the pressure to always be on. Our attention is pulled in 1,000 directions, scattering the mind like leaves in the wind. In such a storm, how can we remember the jewel? The answer is simple, though not easy. We return again and again to the breath, to the present, to the simple practice of being here. Each return is a victory, each moment of awareness a step forward. The fifth obstacle is pride and ego. Ironically, even spiritual practice can feed the very self we seek to see through. We may think, I am more advanced than others. I understand what they don't. I am becoming enlightened. This pride is subtle, seductive, and dangerous. It is the ego wearing the mask of wisdom, but Buddha nature cannot be owned or flaunted. It shines only when humility softens the heart. The sixth obstacle is suffering itself. Life brings pain, illness, loss, betrayal, death. These moments can shake our faith, making us wonder why awakening matters when the world hurts so much. And yet, suffering has always been the great teacher. It was sickness, aging, and death that pushed Prince Siddhartha to leave his palace and seek truth. Without suffering, there is no path. Pain cracks open the shell of complacency and shows us what truly matters. So what do we do with these obstacles? We do not fight them as enemies, nor do we run from them. We learn to see them as mirrors. Each obstacle reveals where we are still clinging, where we are still blind, where we are still afraid. In this way, the obstacles themselves become practice. Doubt teaches faith. Desire teaches impermanence. Fear teaches courage. Distraction teaches focus. Pride teaches humility. Suffering teaches compassion. Like mud feeding the lotus, obstacles nourish awakening. Without them, the jewel might never be uncovered. And here lies the quiet truth. Every time we meet an obstacle with patience, with awareness, with compassion, the jewel shines brighter. The journey is not about avoiding difficulty, but about transforming it. Yet if obstacles are teachers, how do we actually work with them day by day? The answer often lies in the guidance of those who walked before us. The Sangha, the community of practitioners, teachers, and fellow travelers, has always been a source of strength on the path. And so, our next step takes us to the living bond of community, where the jewel of one heart helps polish the jewel of another. Awakening does not wait for us in a distant cave or a hidden monastery. It does not demand that we abandon our jobs, our families, or the messy realities of living. Buddha nature is not separate from daily life. It is revealed through daily life. The jewel shines not only in meditation halls, but in kitchens, on crowded streets, in conversations, and in quiet moments before sleep. The question is not whether Buddha nature exists in our lives, but whether we notice it. Imagine waking in the morning. The mind rushes ahead, the tasks, the deadlines, the endless to-do list. But pause even for a breath. Feel the air enter your lungs. Notice the gift of another day. In that pause, Buddha nature breathes with you. When you eat, notice the food, not just its taste, but its story. The sunlight that nourished it, the rain that fell on it, the hands that planted and harvested it. A simple meal becomes a thread connecting you to the entire universe. Gratitude arises, and gratitude is the fragrance of awakening. When you speak, listen to the tone of your words. Are they rushed, harsh, careless, or are they gentle, honest, kind? Each word has the power to either cloud the jewel or let it shine. Even a small sentence spoken with mindfulness can change the course of someone's day. When conflict arises, as it always does, notice the heat rising in your chest, the tightening of your jaw, the stories forming in your mind. This, too, is Buddha nature revealing itself. For in that very moment you are given a choice, to be swept away by anger or to breathe, to soften, and to respond with compassion. The conflict itself becomes the field of practice. Buddha nature also speaks in silence, in the quiet of tending a garden, in the rhythm of washing dishes, in the laughter of children. These moments remind us that awakening is not about escaping the ordinary, but about entering it more fully. The great Zen masters often pointed to the simplest acts. One was asked, "What is enlightenment?" He replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." Another said, "Chop wood, carry water." These are not riddles. They are reminders that when the mind is fully present, every act becomes sacred. But how do we keep this alive when life is demanding? The truth is, practice does not add weight to our days, it lightens them. Mindfulness does not take extra time. It changes how we experience the time we already have. A deep breath before answering an email, a moment of silence before entering a meeting, a smile offered to a stranger. These are not small things. They are the pulse of Buddha nature lived in real time. And there is a hidden power here. When we live this way, we influence others without even trying. A calm presence in a room filled with stress can shift the entire atmosphere. A kind response in the middle of anger can break the cycle of hostility. Without preaching, without forcing, the jewel within us awakens the jewel in others. This is why Buddha nature is never a private treasure. It radiates. Just as a single candle can light 1,000 without losing its flame, one awakened heart can ignite countless others. And perhaps this is the ultimate lesson. Enlightenment is not apart from life. It is life itself, lived with awareness. Each breath, each word, each act, all are invitations to remember who we truly are. Yet there is still one piece of the puzzle. We have spoken of practice, obstacles, and daily life. But beneath all of this lies the great question: why does it matter? What is the deeper meaning of awakening Buddha nature, not only for ourselves but for the world? That question leads us to the next chapter, where we explore the purpose and promise of this timeless teaching. What does it mean to live as an awakened being? Is it to walk on water, to perform miracles, to shine with supernatural light? The truth is far more ordinary and far more extraordinary. To live awakened is not to escape being human. It is to be fully, completely human. An awakened life is one where wisdom and compassion flow together like two rivers joining as one. Wisdom sees things as they truly are, impermanent, interconnected, empty of fixed self. Compassion responds to that vision with care, kindness, and courage. Together, they transform the way we walk through the world. Imagine meeting anger with understanding instead of retaliation. Imagine facing loss with sorrow, yes, but also with a peace that knows nothing is truly ours to keep. Imagine moving through success without arrogance and through failure without despair. This is the freedom of awakening, not freedom from life, but freedom within life. Living as awakened beings does not mean we never feel pain. The Buddha himself still experienced illness, aging, and death. What changed was how he related to them. He no longer clung, no longer resisted. Pain was present, but suffering dissolved. Like a bird flying through the sky, experiences came and went, leaving no trace behind. In daily life, awakened beings embody presence. When they eat, they taste deeply. When they listen fully. When they act with intention, not out of habit. This presence makes even the smallest moment luminous, and there is a quiet strength in such living. An awakened being may not hold political power, may not seek wealth or fame, yet their presence changes lives. Sometimes without words, sometimes with just a smile, they remind others of their own hidden jewel. History remembers great teachers like the Buddha, but awakening is not confined to saints and sages. It is alive in parents who nurture children with patience, in caregivers who tend to the sick with love, in strangers who choose kindness over cruelty. Living awakened is not about withdrawing from the world, but engaging with it more deeply, more gently, more truthfully. One of the most beautiful qualities of awakened life is humility. True awakening does not shout, "Look at me." It moves quietly, like water flowing downhill, nourishing everything it touches. Those who are most awakened often appear the most ordinary. They do not flaunt wisdom, they live it. Another quality is fearlessness, not the absence of fear, but the absence of being ruled by it. An awakened being can face uncertainty, injustice, even death without losing compassion. Their courage is not born of hardness, but of softness, the softness of a heart that trusts life as it is. And perhaps the clearest sign of awakened living is joy. Not the fleeting joy of entertainment or success, but a deep joy that arises from harmony with reality. Even in the midst of sorrow, there is a lightness, a smile that comes from knowing the jewel cannot be lost. This kind of living is contagious. Just as one flame can light another, the presence of an awakened person sparks the awakening of those around them. Communities form, wisdom spreads, compassion multiplies, and slowly the world begins to change. Living as awakened beings, we are no longer trapped in the question, "What can I get?" Instead, we live from the question, "What can I give?" Not out of obligation, but out of joy. Because when we awaken, we see clearly. To care for others is to care for ourselves, and to free ourselves is to free others. And so the path comes full circle. Awakening is not only about discovering Buddha nature within, it is about expressing it in the world moment by moment, breath by breath. But before we close this journey, there is one final chapter. A reflection, a reminder, and an invitation that the jewel has always been within you, waiting not for tomorrow, but for right now. From the very beginning, this journey has been about a simple, radiant truth. You already are what you seek. The Buddha nature you long for is not a distant treasure. It is not hidden in temples, scriptures, or mountains far away. It is not something you must earn, nor something someone else can give you. It has been within you from the first breath, waiting only to be recognized. Every practice, every teaching, every story along the path is not about adding something new. They are about removing the dust, the doubt, the fear that cover the jewel. They are about reminding you of what has always been yours. When you sit in stillness, when you breathe with awareness, when you act with compassion, you are not becoming enlightened. You are simply uncovering the light that has always been shining inside. Think of the sky. Clouds may cover it, storms may rage across it, night may darken it. Yet behind it all, the sky has never stopped being vast and open. Your true nature is that sky. The thoughts, emotions, and struggles are only passing weather. Awakening is the moment you remember, I am not the storm, I am the sky. And here is the most liberating truth, you do not have to wait. You do not have to perfect yourself first. You do not have to escape life. The jewel is here in this very breath, in this very moment as you listen to these words. You already are what you seek. So live it. Live it in the way you speak, in the way you listen, in the way you treat yourself and others. Live it in kindness, in presence, in courage, in joy. Let your life itself be the teaching. And when doubts return, as they will, when obstacles rise again, as they surely do, remember, the jewel has never left you. Even when unseen, it shines. Even when forgotten, it waits patiently. The Buddha once said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." That lamp is already lit. Your task is only to trust it, to let it guide you, and to share its light with the world. So as this journey closes, perhaps nothing ends at all. Perhaps this is only the beginning of living each day as an awakened being, the beginning of seeing yourself and others as radiant with Buddha nature. And perhaps, if you remember just one thing, let it be this. You are not searching for the jewel. You are the jewel. Before we part, take a quiet breath. If these reflections touch something within you, let this be just the beginning. On this path of wisdom and compassion, no one walks alone. If you feel called to continue exploring, to deepen your practice, to nurture the jewel already within you, I invite you to join this growing community. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, and let these teachings accompany you like a gentle lamp in the night. Share this with those you care about so together we can keep awakening the light in each other. And always remember, the treasure you seek is already shining inside you. Until we meet again, may you walk in peace, clarity, and compassion.